26 people up in here already. That's awesome for a members only live stream. Got 9 likes. Thank you all for being here this evening. This is going to be a fun one. Talking about average inflation rate. And now this is something that we have talked about quite a bit on this channel pretty much ever since John Williams put out his speech talking about monetary policy strategies for a low neutral interest rate world. And now in that speech, he pretty much said it, that the inflation expectation was too low. And so for those of you who follow me on this channel for any length of time, know that we have talked about this speech so many times. I mean, like over and over again. But still, there's one part of that speech that just stands out, right? Today we face an altogether different set of problems stemming from a very low neutral interest rate. That is, the short-term real interest rate consistent with an economy operating at its potential alongside low and stable inflation. Ironically, the problem we need to solve these days is the risk of inflation that is persistently too low rather than too high. So this speech was given in November of 2018, and ultimately for the previous 10 years since the great financial crisis, the Federal Reserve had attempted to achieve a 2% inflation rate and failed, right? They could not get to that 2%. Well, they did a couple of times, but for the most part, they just really couldn't get to that 2% inflation, even with all the quantitative easing and money printing and everything that was taking place at the time. They still couldn't get there. So they knew that they had to do something different. Right? And that's really where they came up with this average inflation, right? Now, in John Williams' speech, he even talks about it. The second option, talking about what they could do as far as dealing with this low inflation and how to deal with this problem, the option of average inflation targeting, whereby the central bank purposefully aims to achieve an above target inflation rate in good times, when the lower bound is not a constraint. Properly designed and implemented, such an overshoot can offset the inflation undershoot during bad times, so that the long-run average inflation rate long-run average inflation and inflation expectations are in line with the target. So now this is what we have now moved into, is average inflation. Now that didn't occur at the time. They were still thinking about it when John Williams wrote that speech. But it wasn't but just a few years later that they did actually change the way the Federal Reserve conducts themselves and moved into average inflation. Now, we know this from, hold on, I got it in here, Powell's speech given August 27th, right? And now in that speech, Jerome Powell had this to say: "We also made important changes with regard to price stability side of our mandate. Our long-run goal continues to be an inflation rate of 2%. Our statement emphasizes that our actions to achieve both sides of our dual mandate will be most effective if long-term inflation expectations remain well anchored at 2%. However, if inflation runs below 2% following economic downturns, but never moves above 2% even when the economy is strong, over time, inflation will average less than 2%. Households and businesses will come to expect this result, meaning that inflation expectations would tend to move below our inflation goal and pull realized inflation down. To prevent this outcome and the adverse dynamics that could ensue, our new statement indicates that we will seek to achieve inflation that averages 2% over time. Therefore, following periods when inflation has been running below 2%, appropriate monetary policy will likely aim to achieve inflation moderately above 2% for some time. In seeking to achieve inflation that averages 2% over time, we are not tying ourselves to a particular mathematical formula that defines the average. Thus, our approach could be viewed as a flexible form of average inflation targeting. Our decisions about appropriate monetary policy will come to reflect a broad array of considerations and will not be dictated by any formula. Of course, if excessive inflationary pressures were to build or inflation expectations were to ratchet above levels consistent with our goal, we would not hesitate to act. So now this is something very interesting to think about, because he says right in there, we are not tying ourselves to any mathematical formula, right? There is no way of figuring out what this average inflation rate is. And that's when I came across this from the Richmond Federal Reserve. And it had this to say: a second significant date, let's see, a significant date, September 2022, or 2020, sorry. September of 2020, when the FOMC revised its statement on long-run goals and monetary policy strategy. In this update, the FOMC adopted flexible average inflation targeting, seek to achieve inflation that averages 2% over time, and stated that following periods when inflation has been running persistently below 2%, appropriate monetary policy will likely aim to achieve inflation moderately above 2% for some time. Since the revised statement was released, headline PCE inflation has run at a pace of 5% per year, and core inflation has run at a pace of 4.4% per year on average. Now, this is important to understand, because this is really where it ties it together, because of that mathematical formula that Jerome says doesn't exist. Here we find where they found a 2% average inflation. Now listen to this. Notably, it is in its update, the FOMC did not define the window of time over which it would be looking back to assess the progress towards its goal. By looking back far enough, it is possible to identify starting dates where the average inflation through present day has come in exactly at target. For example, it shows that figure 1, and there's links down in the description, shows that when considering inflation from October of 2008 through August of 2023, headline PCE inflation averaged 2% per year on average, right on target. All right, so now that's the information right there. That's pretty much all of it in a nutshell. There's still some more stuff that we're going to go over, and we're going to talk about some of the stuff that's going on in these economic letters. But if you got it right there, this is the major change that everybody seems to be missing when they study the Federal Reserve and where interest rates are going to be going and what the Fed's policy is and predicting what the Fed's next move are. Everybody, literally everybody out there, sees the 2% inflation target. This is the way the Fed used to conduct themselves. They would go for a 2% target. If inflation was running above 2%, they would adjust their monetary policy, try to make the conditions tighter, and bring that inflation back down to the 2% target. If it was running under 2%, again, they would adjust their monetary policy to make it more accommodating, to try and bring the inflation back up to the 2%. And whatever happened in the past was bygones, let bygones be bygones, right? And now we're only forward looking when it comes to inflation targeting. That was the Federal Reserve. That's the perception people have. That is pretty much what all the narrative that you find in the mainstream media and all that other stuff, they all have this same belief, 2% target. But that's not what they're doing. They changed it, and hardly anybody ever notices. And if you do notice, when they speak, they talk about the average inflation rate over time. That is it. That right there is the the hidden message, I guess to say, right? Because they don't ever state it, average inflation. They don't talk about average inflation rate over time like they're going for this. They talk about achieving their inflation rate over time, or their inflation goal over time, but then never state what that exact goal is. A few letters, economic letters, have been written talking about average inflation. Now, this particular one is coming out of the San Francisco Federal Reserve economic letter, Average Inflation Targeting in the Financial Crisis Recovery. This is a pretty good letter, and I would like to read from a good section of this, but to be honest with you, I don't think this actually applies in the same way that they are trying to refer to it as, because the average inflation targeting that is referred to in this letter is forward-looking. The average inflation that was described from the Richmond Fed is backward looking, right? So which one is it, right? and I believe it's more from like the Richmond Fed, not so much from what the San Francisco Economic Letter is talking about here. Right? But I'm going to read from some of this just so we can kind of get a better idea of what the forward-looking average inflation targeting would be like. Right? So it goes like this: the Federal Reserve kept its key short-term interest rates, the Fed funds rate, near zero for 7 years during the recession and economic recovery from the 2008 global financial crisis. During this time, inflation stayed stubbornly below the 2% target set by the Federal Open Market Committee. Researchers have analyzed how a low natural rate of interest combined with the zero lower bound on the nominal Fed funds rate make it more difficult for the Fed to resolve trade-offs between the dual mandate goals in stabilizing inflation and achieving maximum employment. In response to this environment, average inflation targeting emerged as a possible strategy to mitigate the effects of the zero lower bound. As discussed in the Mertens and Williams 2019, the FOMC incorporated average inflation targeting in its updated statement on long-run goals and monetary policy strategy at the conclusion of its year-long framework review, Board of Governors of 2020. In this economic letter, I use empirical model of U.S. economy to evaluate how using average inflation targeting immediately following the financial crisis could have led to a different economic outcomes than those observed. My analysis suggests that average inflation targeting would have pushed average inflation up to 2.1, half a percentage point higher than its baseline average for 2009 through 11. Additionally, average inflation targeting would have pushed the baseline average employment for that period down 8 to 8.4%, nearly a full percentage point lower. Importantly, these benefits depend on incorporation of forward-looking expected average inflation into the policy, with a much more limited boost to the recovery occurring if backward-looking measures is used. Incorporating average inflation targeting into monetary policy could have had another important effect by alleviating some uncertainty regarding the economic outcomes during this period. The analysis considers how uncertainty about underlying conditions translates into economic outcomes and finds that forward-looking average inflation targeting would have reduced uncertainty about outcomes by 2/3 relative to baseline strategies. All right. To compare the outcomes of alternative strategies, I use the empirical model described in this particular letter to construct a possible scenario. All right. This is based on standard macroeconomic model commonly used to analyze monetary policy. A main component of this model is economic slack, or unused potential in the economy. For this component, I use the unemployment gap, the difference between current unemployment and the hypothetical level that would prevail in an economy in which companies operate at their full capacity. In such an economy, prices adjust freely in response to unexpected changes in conditions, and some unemployment may still exist. This is very confusing, right? The inflation-adjusted federal funds rate that would be consistent with an economy known as the natural rate of interest is a useful benchmark for monetary policy. In the model, the unemployment gap rises, with the gap between the inflation-adjusted or real Fed funds rate and its natural rate. The intuition is that positive interest rate gap means that financial conditions are tighter, leading households and firms to save money and delay consumption and investment. This lowers the demand and increases the unemployment. Inflationary pressures fall with economic slack, and rise with expected future inflation. Another component in the model is the baseline rule used to guide monetary policy. The rule assumes that the Fed funds rate responds to a combination of natural rate of interest, how much four-quarter inflation deviates from its 2% target, and the unemployment gap. It also assumes that interest rates adjust gradually and acknowledges the influence of the FOMC communications and expect future path of interest rates known as forward guidance. Right? So this is really confusing, guys. I know, I get it, but just kind of follow along just a little bit farther here, right? In this analysis, I consider two scenarios for incorporating average inflation targeting into the baseline model. First, a simple backward-looking AIT considers the same baseline rules, except that the Fed funds rate responds to average deviations in inflation from the 2% target over the previous 8 quarters, rather than only the previous 4. A longer-run view of past inflations, longer than the 8 quarters, right? Longer view of past inflation deviations from the target means that policy will respond for longer periods of time to past misses and thus will provide additional accommodations when the zero lower bound is constrained on the nominal federal funds rate. Another option relies on forward-looking AIT. It considers a rule that responds to current four-quarter inflation deviations from the target as in the baseline, and also responds to expectations that the average inflation will be coming in the coming 4 quarters. This approach focuses less on responding to the past and more on responding to the ongoing and expected future pressures on inflation. Okay? So these are the two different ways that they're looking at it: average inflation targeting, forward-looking, and backward-looking. Right? So that approach focuses less on the response to the past and more on responding to ongoing and expected future pressures on inflation. In other words, past economic disturbances matter only to the extent that they are expected to impact future inflation. Importantly, in each scenario, the analysis assumes that household firms and financial markets will understand the monetary policy rule in that scenario. So that's what's interesting about it is that it requires almost a forward guidance in order to achieve forward-looking average inflation targeting, right? Let me read that again. Importantly, in each scenario, right? I mean, I guess in each one of them it would be that way, but in each scenario, the analysis assumes that households, firms, and financial markets fully understand the monetary policy rule in that scenario. But yet, do you notice that nobody knows about average inflation rate? See, they have everybody making sure that they know what's going on, right? The Fed is going to be lowering interest rates because they are achieving their target, right? But yet nobody understands about average inflation rate. Are they communicating in a fashion that is in line with average inflation targeting? Right? See, it's all about the jawboning, convincing the people of a particular outcome, right? It's gaslighting. People believing that they're going for a 2% target and not going for a 2% average, or not even knowing about the average, and then not being corrected, not only by the Fed, but by anybody else out there. You know, nobody really talks about it. That is gaslighting. Straight up, giving you the ability to believe whatever it is that you are thinking is correct, and them not fixing that and just allowing you to believe that. Straight up. Right? That's the way they conduct themselves. And it's ultimately what they were saying within this whole confusing thing about forward-looking inflation targeting. Right? I think there was one more that I wanted to read to you guys. Okay. This part right here, and this is coming out of the Fed's new inflation targeting policy seeks to maintain well-anchored inflation expectations. And this is a pretty good review too, but I'm just going to read just one little section of it, and then we're going to start talking and breaking this stuff down a little bit more. All right. Let's see here. This statement of long-run goals and policy strategy explicitly acknowledges the challenges posed by the proximity of interest rates to the effective lower bound. By reducing the Fed's scope to support the economy through interest rate cuts, the lower bound increases downward risk to employment and inflation. The statement also highlights that the Fed is prepared to use its full range of tools to achieve its dual mandate objectives, stable prices, and maximum sustainable employment. Notably, the Fed changed its language on inflation, replacing 2% inflation target commitment, and instead said it will seek to achieve inflation that averages 2% over time. Right? Over time. The change is subtle departure from the previous flexible inflation targeting regime. Monetary policy under inflation targeting was systematic. The Fed would equally respond to overshooting and undershooting of the target. The Fed lets bygones be bygones, since it does not attempt to make up for past inflation deviations from target. That was the way they used to do it. This change is a subtle departure from the previous way that they did it when monetary policy under inflation targeting was systematic. The Fed would equally respond to overshooting and undershooting of the target. The Fed lets bygones be bygones since it does not attempt to make up for the past inflation deviations. That's the way they used to conduct themselves, and that is the way that everybody believes that they are still conducting themselves. Right? When you hear the 2% inflation target is being achieved and they are going to go for that target, that is incorrect. They are not going for a 2% target. Right? By comparison, average inflation targeting means that policymakers would consider those deviations and can allow inflation to modestly and temporarily run above the target to make up for the past shortfalls and vice versa. Right? So now, the more I read into this, the more I start to learn about average inflation rate, and the more that I start to consider what this average inflation rate is really going to be like when it comes to the monetary policies coming from the Federal Reserve, I then realized that the 2% target is not even in their view anymore. Like, it doesn't matter 2% inflation going into the future. They just don't care, right? What they care about is what the average inflation rate over time is. And at this point, right, from the way we were reading it from the Richmond Fed, right, which says, for the example, considering inflation from October of 2008 through August of 2023, headline PCE inflation averaged 2% per year, right on target. So for that 15, now obviously, August of 2023 was, quite a few months ago, going on like what, 5 months ago or something. I would imagine that the inflation, the 2% average inflation rate over time is probably not too far off from that 15 years ago. Right? And that's something really interesting to think about, because the Federal Reserve, who's going for a 2% average inflation rate, if to ask themselves, when did we ever achieve a 2% average inflation rate? Have we ever done it? Because if you go and you look at inflation, and supposedly, of course, all this is going off of the Fed's data. So that's one of the things that I find, not to just jump in the middle and just kind of lose track of what I was saying here, but that's something that I find very interesting, is that a lot of people talk about how it's lies, how it's fakery, how it's just all this other stuff. If that was the case, then there's no point in watching anything that the Federal Reserve says or does. Right? There's no point in trying to figure out the monetary policy or anything that comes from that stuff. Right? So this is really where the Federal Reserve is now trying to figure out where that 2% average inflation rate is, right? Well, it's over that 15 years. That's the only time frame that they could find where they actually achieved a 2% average inflation rate over time. All those shortfalls below 2% is now being made up by the incredibly over 2% inflation scenario that we had experienced over the last year, and the combination of the incredibly hot inflation that we have just experienced and all those years of shortfall now has an average of 2% if you look back over 15 years. Now, this is where I find a lot of people kind of lost it and couldn't stay with me, at least from what I am understanding of this, or at least the way I'm starting to view this, is that if you can imagine that the 15 years, right, that it's taken from the inflation that we have now to the shortfalls that have been incorporated into this model, 15 years back, it's now 2% inflation. That's where the model finds it, right? 15 years back, 2% inflation, all the shortfalls, all the extra hot inflation that we've just recently experienced this is where we come up with the 2% average inflation. No other time, no other spot can we find it. If it was 10 years ago, the 2% average inflation would not be 2%. It would probably be much higher than that, right? We had to go out to 15 to find the 2%. See, if you think about it, if it was 1 year from today, 1 year back, the average inflation rate would be much higher. It'd be up around 5% or whatever, right? You take it back 4 years, it might be down, but it's not going to be to the 2%. You take it back 10 years, you might get a little closer to the 2% now that we're incorporating the shortfalls from the deflation or from the inflation scenario that wasn't achieved, right? The below 2%. You have to take it all the way back to 15 years and boom, that's where all the inflation that we have experienced recently, incorporated with all the past failures to achieve inflation at the 2%, now come up with that 2% average inflation rate over time. If inflation was running much hotter than it did, that 15 years would probably be closer to like 10 years or 12 years or something like that, right? Because the inflation scenario that we are now incorporating into the past is much hotter. Therefore, the time frame that you would need in order to achieve that 2% would be shortened up, right? The longer this goes on, the shorter that time frame gets, right? Until eventually you get to a point where you cannot move any closer to the current present moment with the elevated inflation where it's at and still have a 2% average, right? That's the inflection point. Now, this is something really I had to think a lot about this one. I'm like, man, what would happen once they have achieved the inflection point, right? If you have the 2% average inflation rate that was experienced over the last 15 years and inflation stays elevated for a significant amount of time, then that past deviations, that past shortfalls from the 2% inflation target would then start to be less incorporated into the new inflation scenarios that we are experiencing. Does this kind of make sense? I don't know if I'm explaining this right. Actually, you know what? I wonder if I could draw this out. That's what I probably should do, is draw it out on a graph. It would probably make it a little bit easier to understand. But ultimately, if you have incredibly high inflation that we are experiencing now, and that continues on for any length of time, then what's going to end up happening is that instead of being 15 years out for a 2% average, it's going to get down to 10 to 5 and eventually get to that reflection point or that inflection point. And then at that point, if inflation is running extra hot, in order to find the 2% average again, you would have to start moving back out on the timeline. But instead of trying to achieve the 2% target, right, that 2% spot on average inflation, they're trying to bring inflation down to the 2%, right? It's now gone from trying to achieve it to try and reach it, now trying to come back down to it. Right? You guys kind of get me on that? This is where it really kind of blew my mind trying to figure out what was going to happen here. So basically, as that timeline moves up closer, you eventually get to a point where there's nowhere that you are going to find from the current present moment to that past inflection moment where there is a time in which that you would find a 2% average inflation. If inflation is running extra hot, now what you would have to do is move back out onto the timeline to find an inflation scenario that would average the 2% with the incorporated hot inflation. If it stays elevated farther out, you would have to go to find it. So this is really where I think the Fed is trying to find it, is that inflection point, right? That moment in which that you cannot get any closer to the present moment and still have a 2% average inflation. If it starts to run up, right, where inflation is getting hot and you start to have to move back out on that timeline, the Federal Reserve will start to make conditions very accommodating, right, because it's too tight, right? And by making it accommodating, they can get back or move back closer to that inflection point. You see where I'm kind of getting at here? Because if they're average inflation targeting, right, and inflation is running too hot, then the average inflation scenario would then have to start move back out on that timeline. That's them moving away from their target, right? So they would have to make it accommodating, trying to bring the inflation back to the target again, right? If it runs over, again, they would have to adjust it the other way. Am I making sense with this? I don't know. Gosh, I really should have drawn out a graph to make this one work. How would I draw that out? I'll have to think about that. All right. Okay, so I have babbled on long enough here. We went 30 minutes now, and I think I got most of the information out, and I think I was fairly clear on it. I don't know. We'll find out here in just a second. Let's go back and read through some of this. I want to thank everybody who joined the channel, too. We got MR, John Freeman, and Patrick. Thank you so much for joining the channel here, the membership, and having access to this membership-only live video. Like I said, these are becoming some of my favorite videos to do because of the closeness between this community. Like, this is the serious time. Like, we don't have jokers and people who are just screwing around. We're all trying to figure out what is really going on here. All right, the early bird is a duck. Pop, 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 quack, quack. Okay, thank you, Simon. Thank you, Brody. Okay, yeah, here we go. All right, I'm on time. Yeah, you are. Hell yeah. All right. Some more easy money that. Okay. Negative interest rates are a possibility. Hey, we got a super chat. Thank you so much. We'll go and check that out here in just a second. Hi there. Love your work. I don't understand why the number of years would decrease. Say you have. Okay, so the number of years would decrease because that's not set by the Federal Reserve. Like, that's something else that somebody was trying to say, well, they could just manipulate it to be whatever they want. They can't. Right? They can manipulate their current Fed funds rate to try and adjust the current inflation rate. But when you incorporate the average from the past deviations, the shortfalls, and the extra hot inflation, there is a set moment in the past that hits that 2% average inflation. Like, if inflation was running much hotter than it had, then it wouldn't be 15 years back. It might only be 10 years back. But that's going to change. I mean, that will change by tomorrow, right? As inflation continues to run extra hot or runs above the 2% target, that timeline will begin to shorten up, right? Again, this isn't something that the Fed is establishing. This is something that is set right now. Like, the Fed has no choice on where this 2% in margin is going to, or this 2% inflation, this average inflation rate is going to be as far as their timeline back, right? That it's set. It's like, whatever the current inflation rate is today, and you average in the past, that moment is set. If inflation continues to run hot, that timeline is going to start shortening up because they're incorporating all the average, they're averaging throughout the past here. So the longer inflation stays elevated, the shorter that timeline is going to get. If inflation falls, then that timeline moves back out. Like, think about it like this. If you had average, okay, here might be a way to describe it. Let me see. Do I have a pen in here? What did I do with my notepad? There we go. Okay. All right, let me see if I can draw this out so that we can get a little bit better understanding of this. Okay. All right, so let's assume, let me see if I do this right. Okay, we're just going to assume, I just drew a regular line, this is going to be a 2% average inflation rate constant, right? And now, if there was a moment in which that there was a deviation that happened, right? You got this little deviation that came, so you had a 2% average inflation, but then all of a sudden it drops down to like 1.5% right there, right? You got 1.5% inflation. But then it goes back to 2%, right? To 2% average, but you got this little divot right there where it dropped down to 1.5%. Well, the long run average would be like 1.8%. We're just going to assume, I'm making up numbers, right? But then it would be like 1.8%. No matter what you do, no matter how far out on that timeline you go, right? You can go out, a decade. You still got this deviation right here that then tells you that you do not have a 2% average inflation because of this little deviation right there, right? No matter how far back you go or how far out you go. They never maintain that 2%. Like, there has never been a time in history in which, well, I don't know about history, but they're not in recent history anyway, in which that the Fed had averaged 2%, like, or had a 2% target that they maintained for any length of time, right? So now we look at this shortfall again, right? But then it's made up with an increase, right? So we had the shortfall and then it increased. The long run average goes back to 2%, right? Now we could like cut it off right there and say, hey, now it's running extra hot. Like if we don't incorporate that spot, right? Then you can say, hey, inflation is running extra hot, right? But that's not the way that they're doing it, right? So what they have, let me see if I can draw this out, is you got a time period in which that it fell and it ran consistently under that 2%, right? And then what do? All right? So then you start getting an inflation scenario that runs extra hot, right? And now this starts pulling up this long-term average. So if you were to take your average from, or if you were to take your inflation rate today, and I'm just gonna make up a number and say that it was 5%, right? It was 5% today. If you take all the 5% and average all the increase and the shortfalls, right, to try and find somewhere between right here, right now, and somewhere in the past, where was the 2% found, right? And so they take these shortfalls and the increase and they go back and they find it 20 years ago or 15 years ago, right? So 15 years, right? That's how far back from this point that they had to go in order to find that 2%. If they went back to right here, say 10 years ago, they wouldn't have been at 2%. They might have been at like, say, 3% because of all the increased added inflation that we have experienced just recently. So they couldn't go back 10 years because it might have only been 3%. They had to go back 15 years, and that's where they found the 2%. If inflation continues to run hot, well, then they can't go back to 15 years, right? They would have to go back to like 10 years ago in order to find the 2% inflation. If they went back to 20 years ago, right? What would that, then it would be much hotter, right? Did I get that right? Oh no, it would, oh, it would be cooler. Jesus, I'm already starting to confuse myself. Let me see here. Hold on here. Did I get that right? So if inflation is running hotter, yeah. So if inflation was running hotter, then it would run down here to like 10 years ago, right? And that would put it at like, say 2% if they were to come back down here to 10. If they took that same inflation from what we were experiencing now, right, and run it back to the 15 years, then what they would find is that the inflation scenario would have been incorporating, Jesus, I'm doing this. God damn. I got to write this stuff out before I come and try and do this for you guys. Let's see, if it ran up to the height, then they would have to, right, then they would have to incorporate less inflation into it. God damn. Man, guys, I'm confusing myself. I'm gonna have to draw that out and then do it again for you instead of sitting here trying to figure that out and telling you. So if that inflation runs extra hot for an extended period of time, then the time frame would start to move up, getting ever closer to the current time in which the 2% would be found. And that would be the inflection point. Right. And then after that, you would have to start moving back out onto the timeline in order to find the 2% inflation again. Yes, that's okay. So that is correct. As they start coming down, that's what it is. Okay. So since I screwed this all up, let me draw it out here again. We'll bring it down. We'll come up, do this number, then a big spike, and then it starts to fall. All right. So if inflation, okay, so if we come back here, let me do this again. If we come back here and we spike out and it takes 15 years, right, in order to find that 2% average inflation rate, if inflation stays elevated for a significant amount of time, then what will end up happening is that the 2% margin will get closer to the current timeline, right? As it eventually will find a moment there in which that it cannot get any closer to the current timeline before it starts moving above the 2% before it moves above the 2% inflation, average inflation, right? So basically it just gets to a point there where it cannot find any moment in time in which that the 2% average will be found, because the inflation is now running too hot to now incorporate a 2%, or to find a timeline with a deviation below 2% that can incorporate it into a 2% average. Did I get that right? I think so. Okay. So, once they have hit that inflection point, right, and they cannot move the timeline any closer because the average, or because the current inflation rate is now elevated to the point that if they're looking for that 2% average, they have to start moving back out onto the timeline because of the elevated inflation. I'm assuming that once they hit the inflection point, they are going to want to bring the interest rates, the Fed funds rates, down to try and make the economy more accommodating, to bring the inflation back, right? Because ultimately they don't want hot inflation, right? Or not to bring inflation back, to bring the inflation back down to the 2% target, right? So once it hits the inflection point, right, and the Federal Reserve had their tight monetary policy taking place, right, that's when they'll start to loosen the conditions, because if they don't, the elevated inflation will start forcing them back out onto the timeline away from the inflection point, right? So it's basically they would be moving into the opposite of where they are today. See, right now they're making up for the shortfalls. Eventually, once they hit the inflection point, now they would have to make up for the overrise of inflation. Wow, this stuff is so confusing. And guys, I know I'm kind of like thinking this stuff out loud as I'm doing this, but I only kind of like started wrapping my head around this over the last 2 days, or the last couple of days. But I'm pretty sure that I've got this one dialed in now, because everything that I have so far read does not make sense, coming from all the statements that I have ever seen coming from the Federal Reserve and the way that they are planning on conducting their monetary policy, and then the absolute belief that is coming from the mainstream out there about this 2% target. It is so, like, to me, I'm looking at one and thinking, man, are these people not seeing like any of this stuff? I've been stuck on this for so long now, right? That, like, this average inflation thing, and I could never quite figure it out. And this is like, I'm pretty sure I'm getting this dialed in now. And I know, like, this whole graph thing, I didn't quite explain that exactly right. I will figure that part out too, and I will explain that properly. But I'm getting closer here. Let's go read this super chat. I'm babbling around here. Abraham Rodriguez, thank you very much for the $4.99, man. That was very cool of you. All right, let's go back here and start reading through this. All right, negative interest rates, a possibility. I think so, but I think that's probably going to end up being after we run into a cashless society with central bank digital currencies. All right, love your channel. I don't understand. Oh yeah. Then you would need. Okay, let's. Hey everyone, welcome, MR, John, and Patrick. Yeah, absolutely. Glad to see you guys here. Good evening, Simon, and my fellow knowledge questers. Right on. Hey, Steven. I went through the same thing, and I think it's actually because the numbers are below 2% in the 2010s. Something like, only recently have we had high inflation. Now, is the recent inflation enough to revert the below target inflation during the 2010s? I don't know. And what happened if they want to decrease the range to 2020s? Will the force deflation? But you're right in the case where inflation has been running persistently high. Gotcha. Thanks. Hey, dishes. Hey. All right. Smoke that like button to get all algo high. There you go. The Fed is full of attorneys, and as I hear this, it sounds more and more like a CYA contract. This forward guidance is legal notice so they can say, see, told you so later. But they can make up for past deviations if no one but us holds them accountable. This current 2% average has ambiguity. God, why do I have such hard time with some words? Good Lord. Ambiguity. God. From where the start, the timeline, and where they decide to declare the goal achieved. Hearing all the good news out of call. Hey Rocco, hey Nider. How is the new investment going? No hiccups yet. That's awesome to hear, bro. I am about taking action and doing things. Internalizing stuff is fantastic, but action is everything. F fear. There you go, man. What you're saying is white lies lead to more and more lies. 2024 is going to be a good year building connections and circles. All right. To decrease the distance to the 2% point, they can have to go forward. They have to go forward from here and revert what happened in between. What does Georgie say? Orwell, that is. Average inflation debt spiral. If there was above target inflation, they have to add below target inflation in the present. If there was below target inflation, they have to add above target inflation in the present. Yeah. Now, how short do they want the range to be? No one knows. Yep, take that glass from half full to overflowing. Get us simpletons focused on whatever it is: football, beer, gambling, politics, inflation, and big old booties. Yeah, I like big booties. All right, the Fed has only one option: inflate. Okay. Thanks, Abraham. Okay, why haven't we reached the inflection point yet where the Fed is expanding the time they take into consideration for the average inflation rate over time? See, well, that's the thing. Like, how long does it take? Like, okay, so let's say, for example, we haven't had inflation yet. Say, like, we're 2020, like 2019, December of 2019. And nothing's happened yet, right? We don't have the inflation scenario. We have failed to achieve the 2% target for like at least a decade. Now, we are assuming from the papers that we read that the recent inflation that we had experienced says that an average of 2% can be achieved if we look back 15 years. Well, what if we didn't have the inflation scenario? How far back will we have to look in order to find a 2% average inflation rate? Like, I don't know. I mean, if we didn't have any inflation to compare, like if we didn't have any of the recent inflation to put into the equation, would that be 25 years? Would it be 20, 25 years? Who knows how far back we would have to go in order to find a 2% average inflation rate over time? Right? Because there had been basically no inflationary scenarios significant enough to raise the average inflation rate up to 2% unless we go back far enough to find it. Right? But because we had that recent round of inflation, right, and all this over the last few years, now we only have to go back 15 years to find the 2% average inflation. Right? What if they let it run like really, really hot, right? And the average inflation went out, or the 2% average inflation rate went out to 10 years. Right? At some point, if inflation runs elevated, that timeline is going to find a point in which they cannot get any closer to the present day, right? Before the 2% average inflation rate can no longer be found, right? So there's an inflection point, boom. Once it meets that time, then you have to start going back out onto the timeline again in order to find the 2% average inflation, because the elevated inflation rate that has been so significant. So it's literally like that inflection point where it's meeting the opposite side, right? It's like literally like all that I was saying, the glass is now full and you're overflowing, right? That's the inflection point. So to me, like the Federal Reserve, once they have hit that inflection point, that can be the targeting that they can go for. If they are above the inflection point, right, with the Fed funds rate, meaning basically the inflation is running too hot, they can adjust monetary policy to bring inflation down, hopefully, right, to then be under that inflection point, so that they can always try to maintain where that inflection point would be. That would be the average inflation rate. And if they were able to maintain that on a consistent basis, then the average inflation rate would be a consistent 2% target, which we already know that they are going to fail to do, because they cannot do a 2% target. They failed at that for the previous 10 years. So does all that kind of make sense now? I don't know. I will eventually figure out a way to say this with a graph that will make total sense. But I'm still trying to figure it out, I guess. All right. But I think we're getting it. I mean, I think like inside, like once we think about it, like we may not be able to explain it straight out, but I think like a lot of us are probably getting this, Why haven't we reached the inflection point yet? Okay. I think the theory is that we want to make it as short as possible. If the Fed's dream scenario, the inflation rate would be perfectly at 2%, so the time range would be instantaneous. That's right. That's right. But there are economic forces that aren't under their control, so to compensate, they have to look back, but they are trying to get as close as possible, I think. There we go. See, now this is it, man. I think you're onto it. All right. Yes, the visuals really help. Okay. I'm sorry I kind of screwed that up, but I'll figure it out. I'll make it better for you. All right. I made the same exercise as Yui, on the paper on Google Sheets with formulas. Really helped me visualize it. Right on. Yes. See, I knew this was I couldn't quite figure it out. I couldn't figure out that average inflation, especially after Jerome says we are not holding ourselves to any mathematical formula. I was like, you can't do that. That's not the way, you can't do that. Like, this is like, it's not meant to be left up to emotions and feelings and stuff like that. It's supposed to be very systematic, or at least in some form of being like a process, right? Step 1, step 2, step 3. If these guys are just kind of flying at the seat of their pants, then it would be very much like the way that most people feel from the Federal Reserve, and that they don't have any control over anything, right? Which is true, because control is kind of an illusion, but they are not out of control. They didn't lose control over inflation. They didn't lose control over the interest rates. They didn't lose control over any of that stuff. It's very much in line with what it is that they were looking for. And I mean, this explains it. Like, the inflation scenario that we have had just recently was a favor to the Federal Reserve. It was like to their benefit. They didn't get damaged by that. They got benefited from the inflation. Right? Not like they were losing their monetary policy. They were becoming essentially like irrelevant. Like, they were eventually going to become irrelevant, and the whole system was going to crash, right? If they could not get that inflation back, if they could not get the Fed funds rate back up. I mean, they might have had tools and possibilities and negative interest rates and cashless societies and central bank digital currencies and all these things they could deploy. But really, considering how they conducted themselves up until just recently, the adjustment of the Fed funds rate would be typical. But once they hit the zero lower bound, like, dropping interest rates was no longer an effective tool, and they were out. They were out of business. All right. Simon, the written visual really made a difference. Appreciate that. Well, thank you, Self-Education. I'm going to, like I said, I will figure out that graph so that it makes a lot more sense when, I start to explain it. But like I said, I just kind of tried to just do that off the whim here. Also, draw back the average falls As timeline is more recent, the average is higher. Yeah, well, the average would begin as the inflation is running higher, the average would then start to move closer, right? Until it eventually reaches that inflection point. And then if inflation stays elevated, then they would have to start moving back out onto the timeline again in order to achieve the 2%. But it would basically be on the opposite side. It would be once the glass is filled and then you'd be overflowing. That would be moving back out on the timeline. Moving closer would be filling the glass up, right? So once they got to the inflection point, then if they kept inflation, if inflation continues to run elevated, the glass will fill up. There is no more getting closer to the current present, and then they would have to move back out onto the timeline to find that 2% average inflation rate over time with the elevated inflation that we are experiencing. So if inflation started to fall at that point, then again, that timeline would be moving back up to closer to the present day. Stuff is tough, yo, right? I mean, but once we figure it out, man, it's like the whole world starts to open up with all the new like ways of thinking about how it is that you are going to be looking at the Federal Reserve and their strategy. Right? All of this to say that the Fed is in no hurry to lower rates because the average over time is still below the 2%, depending on how far back you go. Yeah. They reach the inflection points. Once they reach the inflection point and they want to keep decreasing the timeline further, they would be forced to deflationary or below target inflation. Yep, that's right. Yep, that is exactly right. So that's why we're seeing, like they were saying, there's going to be deviations from the target and vice versa, whether it's above or below. There is no more going for a target. See, that's what blows me away. Like the Federal Reserve will not be going for a 2% target, period. That doesn't, there is no target. It's just like, like we used to have a range, and down the range there was a target, and we used to try and aim for the center of that target, and now there's no target. There's nothing to shoot at, right? That's what's amazing me about this. It's like there's nothing to really shoot at. The Federal Reserve is now looking at how far away to that inflection point there is. Like that's how I've seen it anyway. I mean, I haven't found the exact statement that says it, but from what I'm gathering of it, that's what they're looking at. Like that's the target. Like how close to that inflection point are they? They keep the interest rates or keep the inflation elevated, right? Or keep the conditions tight, right? In order to create or if they kept the conditions accommodating to keep the inflation elevated, there we go. Right, then that timeline would shorten up, right? The target, the inflection point is the target now. But I don't think they really even know where that's at. And it would really depend on future inflation and future inflation expectations. Yeah, so it would basically depend on the future of what inflation is. If inflation begins to fall dramatically, that timeline starts to move back out again. Right? But if inflation stays elevated, even if it's just slightly above 2%, then that timeline would start moving closer and closer. I think that's what they're going for. I think they're looking for that inflection point. All right, 2% per year, and their interpretation is overtime, not overtime. Like the real care, not oversight. Like they really cared. No oversight. Oh. All right. Eventually, the adjustment they'd have to make will be smaller and smaller to stay at the 2% average. In an ideal scenario, of course, then another event happens and they have to fight it all over again. Yeah, because I think that's exactly right. Like I think the over, under would eventually find themselves at an equilibrium of 2%. So like, if they follow this average inflation over time, backward looking, and they adjust their monetary policy to then try to stay within line of that inflection point, right? Once they reach the inflection point and they are at 2%, that would basically make them like 2% average inflation rate over time and at the target. Did I get that right? I think so. And then at that point, they could try to maintain that target again, which they won't do because there's going to be deviations, right? Whether it rises or falls. And if it does, they will adjust their monetary policy again to try and make up for the fact that it had fallen or risen. And again, you're right, starting back over again. I totally agree. Like, I think the inflection point is what they're looking for. Once they hit the inflection point, then they're basically back to, they could go back to targeting or attempting to targeting if they could, right? If they wanted to. Yeah, I think I got that. All right. Like another pandemic, economics crisis, a war, or something like that. Nuclear war, maybe. Thank you for the explanation. This makes more sense now. Well, thank you, Abraham. And that was the point. I know it's like the same video since Sunday and again today, and then like this one is kind of like rehashing the same thing over and over again, but like going over this information repeatedly like a few times, this is really how you lock it in. This is how you internalize the stuff. Sometimes we can read it just one time, we can grasp it, kind of understand it, but then we don't necessarily like have internalized it or can recall it. Doing this over and over again like we're doing here, this is how we make it like set in stone, like cemented in. And that way, next time we hear somebody says, well, when the Federal Reserve achieves their 2% target, we can laugh. We can say like, yeah, no, sorry, bro, you're wrong. There is no 2% target. They haven't done that for quite a while now, all right? And everything that person says can really be taken with a grain of salt, right? They may have credible information. They may have very valid factual stuff, but because they missed that first part, their whole strategy is now screwed, right? Because they're thinking of a 2% target that just simply doesn't exist. It's an illusion. All right. All right. With the focus from the Fed of keeping the inflation going for longer, would they still be incentivized to raise rates even just a little more while still keeping their dual mandate? With the focus from the Fed of keeping the inflation going for longer, I don't think they necessarily care about the inflation itself going hot. What they care more about is the inflation expectation remaining elevated. See, this is really where the main problem is. When inflation expectation falls, then it starts dragging down everything else with it, including real inflation, including the inflation. Right? So if they can get the inflation expectation to be elevated, then that's really ultimately what they're looking for, right? Because the Federal Reserve is constantly swimming up a stream of deflationary scenarios. And that part is so difficult for it took a long time for me to even grasp that. But it really is. Once the Federal Reserve has moved closer to the lower bound of zero, monetary policy becomes very difficult to try and cause any kind of stimulus or inflation into the economy. And the main reason is because of the very low return on capital investment. Once you have hit the lower bound of zero and you have low interest rates, the getting a return on your capital to reinvest back into the economy is almost gone. In fact, in a lot of cases, it will go negative when you consider the inflation scenario after that. So the return on capital investment that is pretty much negative when you're at the lower bound of zero with low interest rates is a very like deflationary scenario. Even though you have the Fed accommodating, it doesn't matter just because the return on capital investment going back into the economy has gone negative. That's the deflationary scenario. Just inherently deflationary, right? So this is one of the major problems, is that no matter what the Fed did, they couldn't find the inflation scenario they were looking for, even after all the quantitative easing of 1, 2, 3, and 4. And this is what blows me away about it, is that this massive quantitative easing that had taken place during the great financial crisis, one of them, I mean, I was definitely one of the people out there screaming hyperinflation during this time, right? But it failed to manifest itself, right? And this is the reason why. Right? It's because of the low interest rates and being near the zero lower bound, right? The inflation scenario could not be found, right? But once you sever the supply chain, hand a bunch of people stimulus checks, cause a supply-demand imbalance, then you got the inflation scenario they were looking for. Yeah, and it totally saved their bacon, like straight up. Let me go find the super chat here. Abraham, thank you so much for the 99. Thanks again for all this effort to simplify this. Yeah, you bet. Now, again, like sometimes, like especially with the drawing out of this chart, like this is the first time I tried to draw that, so I didn't do a very good job of it, but I will figure that part out. I will make it understandable. And this is the thing, like all this information that we are going through, this isn't so complicated that we can't figure it out. Right? Most of the time, when the Federal Reserve or anybody else talks about these things, they make it so difficult to understand. They make it very complicated. So once we break it down and we do kind of get it, like what's happening here, we look back at some of the way that they talked about these things, and it's like, why did you make it so convoluted, right? And they do this on purpose so that people will not understand it. Like this is done intentionally. If they wanted us to know how this operation works, then they would teach it in school, right? They don't want you to know. What they do teach you in school is how to obey the process, right? But they don't ever tell you how to question it, right? Just obey it, right? And so once you're in school and you learn about the Federal Reserve and you learn that it's all about obeying the system and not necessarily so much about like questioning it, then you don't have any questions for it. You understand the Fed. You like, I don't question the Fed. I know what they do. I learned that back in high school, right? And so now you don't question it at all. Somebody who didn't understand the Fed from the beginning questioned it the entire time, and I'm still questioning them to this day. I don't fall for their narrative, right? Or fall for the narrative out there. I listen to their exact words, and I try to figure those ones out. Right? Not what somebody else's interpretation of it is. This is what I find like kind of hilarious about this whole thing, is that like, you know, people have come to me in the past and it was just like, where do you get this? Where do you think that you come up with this stuff? Like, you know, give me some place where I can validate this information. And I'm thinking, the Fed. Like, I'm getting everything that I learned directly from the Federal Reserve's documents. Like, I can't go to anybody else. Like, there's nobody else to go to except for these guys. And unless they want to explain it, which they don't, there's nobody else who's going to, right? Except for somebody else who's reading their stuff and then interpreting it and putting out videos about it. But there's nobody I can go to. There's no person who's like the Fed expert that I'm going to go to that says, hey, man, I know more about this than anybody else. Maybe Joseph Wang. I mean, that dude knows a lot about the Fed, right? So, I mean, I guess if there was an expert, I would go to Joseph Wang, right? And ask him about some of this stuff. But other than that, I'm going to internalize this stuff for myself, figure this stuff out for myself, and learn about it for myself. And once I do that, then I don't question, like, my beliefs, right? I question what that dude believes because I know what I'm believing. I've figured this stuff out for myself. Now, whether I'm right or wrong, that's, I guess, you know, the history, you know, time will tell, you know, whether that is the case. But I'm not making stuff up, right? I'm not assuming a lot of these things that a lot of people are assuming coming from the Federal Reserve, like target inflation. You know, this is how I do it, you know. All right. Let's see here. So with the focus on the Fed from keeping inflation going for longer, would there still be incentivized to raise rates even a little more while still keeping their dual mandate? Yeah, I don't know. Let me see. I think I read that one already. I don't think they would keep it longer. I think they would just attempt to try and achieve that 2% inflection point. I mean, I think that's probably what they're more after. The unemployment rate was a big concern of the Federal Reserve, and they do talk about it in here, but even still, like recent statements coming from the Federal Reserve says that they can have elevated interest rates and not worry so much about the unemployment rising dramatically like they once did. So it kind of like almost neutralizes part of their dual mandate. All right, ZERP leaves no room for manipulation and leaves a scar for the future manipulation to deal with. Yeah. With the glass metaphor, they could go back, but they could also empty the glass a little. But they really can't empty the glass, right? Because like, here's the thing, like there's no manipulation of the 2% average inflation rate over time, because there's no other place in history that you can find or at least going back, from this date going back, in which that you will find a 2% average inflation rate except for one date, right? So you take the current inflation rate and you just go back, and eventually you will find a 2% average. And there's nothing, like there's no manipulation of that or whatever. Like that is where it's at, right? Now the manipulation can come from the Federal Reserve's end of things with their interest rates trying to adjust inflation, right? If they can get inflation to move up and down, then that moment is going to be a different moment, right? It's not going to be the one that we're pinpointing today. It's going to be a different spot, right? Because you have to incorporate the new amount of inflation that has been incorporated into the system. So there's no, like, to me, this is not a manipulation. This is not a manipulative way of finding where that average inflation rate and timeline is. Like that is set, right? Now, the manipulation might come in like how they determine what inflation is. Like that can be manipulation. Manipulation in interest rates, manipulation in like unemployment, like all these manipulated numbers and stuff like that. But if you were to take them for factual numbers or real numbers like the Federal Reserve is using, because we're not the ones who are in charge of monetary policy, they are, so we have to kind of go off of whatever it is that they're looking at and assume that what they are looking at is accurate, because that's what they are going to use in order to come up with the monetary policy. So we can assume or believe or think something completely different about these numbers. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what we think. It doesn't matter what I think. It doesn't matter what George Gammon thinks. It doesn't matter what Joe Biden thinks. It doesn't matter what anybody thinks out there, right? What does matter is where the Federal Reserve is going to be moving their monetary policy in accordance to what the 2% average inflation rate over time is, right? If they want that 2% average inflation rate to be closer to them, then they will keep the interest rates. Well, I guess they would lower interest rates to get the inflation rate to be elevated to move that time closer. That's the manipulation inside of it. But the 2% average inflation rate over time, that's set. That like there's nothing the Fed can do about changing that right now, because it just is what it is according to where the interest rates or the inflation rate is today. Yeah, I think I got that. All right. I think the inflection point is the point at which they will reach their target. It's just the point at which they have to change to deflation below target to keep moving the timeline forward. Perhaps I'm wrong. I don't know. No, I think you're onto something there. What is it? Sabiki? I'm sorry. Tom. There it is. Tom. All right. Thanks, Abraham. Okay. Thank you very much, Abraham, for that super sticker, too. I appreciate it. It's a super chat. Okay, because if you just go 1 year later, the average over time to the inflection point will go above 2% without deflationary below inflationary pressures. Yeah. All right. Yeah, or you have to start moving back out onto the timeline. Yeah, that's right. See, yeah, you're getting this. I think you're getting it. Yeah. All right, I get what you're typing, Tom. Seems to have merit. Yes, I agree. All right, I'm trying to figure it out as I type. And that's just so funny because I was trying to figure it out as I was drawing this graph too. Oops, these are my papers here. God, I have printed out so much documents from the Fed. Like I have a stack of stuff that I have printed out. I don't even know what I have. All right. Thank you, Tom. Your comments help me understand. Yes, absolutely. Me too. Yep. School is propaganda to make you a good economic drone, except maybe the top schools that you need to be a billionaire to access. Yep. They teach the real stuff. Yeah. That I agree. Like you can achieve a certain level of like education in which they do teach you this kind of stuff, right? But you're like that's not for guys like me. Some courses are definitely useful, but they are only showing the part of the truth that doesn't affect them. The source and lots of personal thought backed up with a chilly live stream. All right, you want to collaborate with Joseph? I'll see about making that happen if so. Yeah, I really should. I mean, I've talked to Joseph quite a few times, so I mean, it's not like we don't know each other. In fact, he spoke at the Rebel Capitalist right after I did, I believe, because I remember he was sitting there typing it out, and I asked him if he was nervous, and he just kind of looked at me and smiled and said, yeah, and then went back to typing it. I was like really nervous, you know, but yeah, Joseph's cool. I like Joseph. He's a nice guy. Does the Fed say anything to rule out the weighted moving average, such as exponentially weighted? I don't know. It's pronounced shabiki. Shbiki. I'm sorry. It means fast in Polish. All right. Well, I'll look it up and I'll learn how to say the name properly, man. I'll learn how to say your name right. The date they can manipulate is the date they declare victory. All right. I also read it as sabiki, like the multi-hook fishing rig. Oh, I get it. Right on, guys. Man, okay, so cool. The bottom of the comments. This was a very awesome live stream. We're an hour and 15 minutes into it. I think we really covered a lot of what this average inflation rate is and how the Federal Reserve is intending on using this average inflation rate in their monetary policy. Again, like, I think the most important part of this, at least for understanding it, is that they are no longer going for that 2% target. And this is how 99% of the people are seeing it out there. I mean, by simply just understanding that it's an average inflation rate over time and not a 2% target completely like changes everything about the strategy, right? And including how it is that we should be responding to some of the information that we are getting out there. Like, especially when you're reading from the Wall Street Journal, or you're reading from Bloomberg, or you're reading from, you know, somebody who works at JP Morgan, and they totally are not even remotely coming close to using this sort of understanding about the Federal Reserve and their monetary policy. If they are not doing that, they're really I don't want to say their argument or their opinion or anything else is invalid. I don't want to say that at all, but it really makes it very difficult to have any kind of, you know, belief that their opinion is going to have any kind of like future outcome coming close to what it is that they are believing. Like, I don't want to tell them that they're lying or wrong or just stupid or something like that, because that's not the case. Almost everybody is a very intelligent person, especially when they're talking about the economy, especially if they're on TV, especially if they can talk about the Federal Reserve and stuff. So I'm just the uneducated economist. These guys are, you know, experts, so to speak. So if they are talking in a way that is so matter of fact about the Fed's target, they missed it. They missed it. And if they aren't missing it, then they're propaganda. It's propaganda, right? So it's only one of those two things, because a target is not accurate. That is not the accurate way of looking at it. And so when I look down there at the mainstream media and everything that's going on, it really seems to me that that literally 99% of the people miss it. Are literally missing it. Like 1% of the people understand. I have brought this up to so many people that even know about, like, you know, follow the Fed somewhat. Like, they may not know exactly, because, you know, understanding the Federal Reserve and who they are and what they do is really complicated, and the average person doesn't even care, right? So the few people I've asked about it, they have no clue about like what a 2% target is. They certainly don't know about average inflation rate over time, right? So we are unique. Like, that makes us in a very unique position. Until people become aware of it, we're the only ones who know. Like, literally, you know, even some of the great, you know, minds, you know, in the macroeconomics world out there, they don't get it. I've got a B-Day anniversary party to attend soon. Alrighty, all-nighter. We're going to end this chat here real soon, man. It depends on where the average 2% inflation rate goes back to and what they need to to compensate for what happened moving forward from here. You know, I absolutely agree with that. All right, deja vu. Love it. Thanks, Deja. All right. All signs point at inflation with no end until the current system can't take it anymore, and we are convinced to take the new system for our own good. I don't know. It sounds like, I don't know, this kind of doomsday scenario kind of thing. And I'm not trying to say that it won't happen. Like, I'm I'm big into the kind of like, letting my mind wander on stuff like that too. But ultimately, I have to take the position in which that nothing bad, or like, what did I say? Nothing bad. That's not the right. I have to take the position in which that the system continues, right? Because if I take the position in which that the system fails, right, then I will never be in a position in which that I can advance myself, where I can best position myself to in investments and stuff like that, because I will always constantly be in a safety position, like a survival mode. Here's the problem with survival mode, right? It's a fear. It's a fear energy, right? And now when you live in fear, or you live in depression, or you live in like survival mode, or anything that is got you in a fight or flight, right? What ends up happening is that the energy that's within you starts moving out to your extremities, right? It puts it into your hands and feet, because you got to either be ready to fight or whatever, right? Because that's where your energy needs to be, is ready, right? Ready to combat. And now when that happens and you do that, that's a very negative energy, right? And so you have this negative, energy that you're putting out there to the world, right? And this is what you're going to end up receiving back. And so if you're in this defensive fight or flight mode, this constant negative energy, then it will be very difficult to make connections, to find business partners, to find good business deals and things like that, because you're going to constantly be feeling like the negative from it, right? You will feel like worried and scared and stuff like that. So what ends up happening if you reverse that, right? And you take it and you start moving into the position of peace and comfort and love and happiness, right? Well, what happens is that energy moves from your hands and feet and moves into your core, right? Once you have it in your core, this is a very positive energy that is now being projected out there to the world. Now making business deals is a lot easier. You're finding those connections. You're just, almost start to appear lucky in a way, right? And this is the reason that happens from it, is literally comes down to the energy that you are emitting out there to the rest of the world, right? If it's in a fight or flight negative energy, then that's what you're going to get back, right? And I'm not saying that it's a bad deal. There's times in which that you need to be in that, right? There's very much so, like, there's times, but that's only brief, and that shouldn't be the constant. The constant should be the other one, in peace and happiness and love and harmony, right? And by doing that, then you'll have much better chance at survival in general, instead of being in that survival mode all the time. All right. Let's see here. All signs point to inflation, no end. Okay. But the euro-dollar system is a pressure release valve. I agree, but if we don't know how far back they are going, then no one can ever predict what the Fed will do. Is that the point? No, but we do know how far back they're going. We know exactly, right? We know exactly right now, from this moment, if we go back in time, exactly right where that 2% average inflation rate is, right? And that's the whole point about it, is that is not some arbitrary number from the Federal Reserve. It's not them just saying, oh, hey, by the way, guys, this is where it's at. It's not. We don't need the Federal Reserve to tell us where that moment is. We can figure that out on our own, just by the inflation rate that is occurring today and the past inflation that has occurred. We don't need the Federal Reserve to tell us where that margin is, or how far out that timeline is. We can figure that out on our own. What we don't know is how the Fed is going to be conducting themselves going into the future. Are they going to allow that inflation to run elevated for a significant amount of time to shorten up that timeline to get us closer to that inflection point. Again, like I can't find anywhere on any of their documents talking about an inflection point. Like I don't even know if that's their goal or not, but it just seems logical to me from the things that I have been reading about it, you know. And so again, like that's not arbitrary to the Fed. Right? That is set. That is a set moment that we don't need the Fed to figure out. And as time goes on, we can figure that out without the Federal Reserve. Like if inflation stays elevated, we can do our own calculations to figure out exactly how far back we would have to go to find the 2% average inflation rate. And so again, like this isn't like, people will look at the Federal Reserve saying, hey, they're just making it up, they're lying, they're just pushing whatever. Okay, like, I mean, if that's the position you want to take with it, then that's fine, but that's really like not really leaving you with the ability to make a good decision for yourself, because now you're making decisions based on the idea that the Fed doesn't know what they're doing, or that they're lying, or something of that nature, right? If that's the case, then how are you supposed to invest off, or how are you supposed to conduct yourself off of that? Like, I can't do that. Like, I mean, I understand that there is some job owning and there's some stuff that's being said out there. I'm focusing in on what I believe that Fed strategy is. Like, you know, there's a bunch of people who talk about it. You got Michelle Bowman and John Williams and Christopher Waller and all these other people, right? And you start putting all their words together and you start coming up with a particular strategy that they're going for. Is it exact? Probably not. And every one of us are probably going to interpret that a little differently in accordance to how it is that we give meaning to this information, right? I mean, that's literally how it goes. Like, I can read the same thing that All-Nighter reads, and he can give it one meaning, and I'll give it another, and it might be something different from what it is. So again, it's all about the meaning that you're giving this information to. And I think, like, now that I get this a little bit better, I mean, if I'm, at least from what I feel that I've gotten this a little bit better, it's starting to make a lot more sense on how it is that I feel that the Federal Reserve is going to be conducting themselves going into the future, especially with the interest rates remaining low for a very long time. Remember this? The Fed, like, people were saying that the Fed was doing doing all kinds of damage by keeping the interest rates low and causing inflation to run hot. It makes sense now. It makes total sense why they would let the inflation run hot. I knew that they were doing it for the average inflation rate, but now I really understand it a lot better. You know? Okay. Okay. They find the nearest point where, from today, average inflation rate is 2%. According to the speech UE was reading in 2023, it sounds around 2007. Here's exactly the point. The Fed is all about CYA, cover your ass. So moving forward from 2007, we have below target inflation. So theoretically, to compensate, they would have to keep inflation above target for some time. That's it. Yes, starting to see that. Yeah. Cover your tracks. Oh, okay. All right, current rates keeping inflation at around 3.4 above target. I believe they'll keep them there because it fits what they need to do. Are you making the 3.4 calculation? Just the latest U.S. inflation print that comes out a couple of weeks ago. Running these types of calculations would be a good discussion. Illustration. Yeah, and like, you know, once we get a little bit better understanding of how this is actually functioning, and, you know, now that we kind of have a little bit better clue of it, when we start to read through a lot of the Fed speeches and statements and listening to a lot of the interviews, we're going to pick up on a lot more of the average inflation verbiage that is coming out of them that a lot of people won't pick up. Like, still, just think about the average inflation, or just think about 2% inflation over time. All right. A lot of people take that as they are going to try and shoot for 2% over the next few years, right? Over time, right? But we understand it much differently now. It's 2% over time, backward looking. Right? And so understanding it just in that difference is making it makes a huge difference, right? It makes all the difference in the world about how it is that you feel that the Fed is going to be, conducting themselves, how it is that you need to conduct yourself, right? All right, CRA showing old tractable equations and the assumed one to back into 2% in the year X would help me understand. Showing old tractable equations and the assumed one to back into 2% year. I'm missing it. Okay, well, anyway, guys, this has been a really fun live stream. We're an hour and a half into it. I think that's probably good. We should probably go ahead and cut it right there. Most of the information, I believe, has been presented. The questions have really, some really good questions, and definitely some good comments coming out of this, kind of clarifying some of the ideas and thoughts that are within this theory here. And I don't even think it's much of a theory. I think it is a theory until we actually know exactly how it works, but I think we're a lot closer to understanding it than most people will be. So thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much for participating in this discussion. This is a good one, and I think as we go on from here, incorporating average inflation rate into the theories and into some of the discussions that move on from here is going to make it a very unique position for us to be in, understanding it in a lot better fashion like we do. So thank you for being part of this, and thank you for being part of this discussion, and everything that you do for the channel here. All right, can't wait for the next live stream and next Fed communications through our lens. Yeah, me too. The Fed has no shortage of curve balls in there. Yeah, that's for sure. Let me turn this on. There we go. Our new lens. Yeah. Yes, this was very productive. This was a very productive. This is what I really was hoping for out of doing the memberships, was this exact kind of thing, right? Where we get this information, we really discuss it down, we really kind of take it in and understand it for ourselves in a way that is digestible, right? I mean, we read through this economic letter coming from the San Francisco Federal Reserve, that thing is mind-numbing to try and read through that. But breaking it all down and having a discussion and talking about it like we do from a working class point of view finally makes it understandable, and we can do this thing. So I don't want to give up, but I gotta call it quits, guys. Uneducated Economist, you guys let me know. Thanks for everything. Good stuff. Thanks, Simon. All righty, guys. You have a great night. Thank you. Guys and girls.